Inflation falls, rupee weakens further, and growth concerns rise, narrowing choices before the central bank. After breaching the upper threshold of the RBI's inflation targeting framework in October, inflation has trended lower in subsequent months. From 6.21% in October, retail inflation fell to 5.48% in November, and as per the latest data of National Statistical Office, has fallen further to 5.22% in December. This decline has in part has been driven by a moderation in food prices. The consumer food price index fell to 8.39% in December, down from 9.04% in November. Vegetable inflation continued to ease, falling to 26.6% in December. The sharp sequential fall in vegetable prices in January, as some analysts have pointed out, is likely to bring down headline inflation further. Core inflation remains subdued. Considering this inflation is trending lower in line with expectations. This is the last inflation data before the February meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee. It could open up space for the central bank to ease policy rates. However, there are other considerations as well. The rupee continues to fall. On Monday, it crossed the 85 mark against the dollar. The greenback continues to strengthen. The dollar index, which means its value relative to a basket of major currencies, is hovering around 110. Recent data points to the strength of the US labor market. Non-farm payrolls rose by 256,000 in December, significantly exceeding expectations. This may mean that US Federal Reserve won't opt for even fewer rate cuts this year. This prospect of monetary policy remaining tight has led to the 10-year US bond yield rising further to 4.78%. The pressure on the currency is likely to continue. Over the past few months, India's foreign exchange reserves have fallen sharply from 701 billion on October 4, 2024 to $634 billion as on January 3, 2025, which part of a decline could in while part of a decline could perhaps be due to revaluation issues. This fall provides revaluation issues. This fall provides some indication of the central bank's intervention in the currency market to stem the rupee's fall. Stock markets continue to correct. On Monday, the BSE Sensex fell to 1.36%. Foreign investors continue to be sellers. Net investments by foreign portfolio investors are at minus $2.7 billion up to January 13. On Monday, Brent crude oil was up 1.7%, touching $81 per barrel amid fresh US sanctions on Russian oil producers. This could have implications for inflation. Alongside concerns over growth are mounting. After a second quarter slump, GDP growth has slowed down to 5.4%. The RBI lowered its estimate for the full year to 6.6%, but the first advance estimates released by the NSO have pegged growth even lower at 6.4%. Nominal GDP is expected to be below 10% for the second straight year. Clarity on US tariffs and the stance of the Fed will emerge after Donald Trump's swearing in on January 20 and the Fed meeting later in the month. Thereafter, the Union budget will provide details on the center's fiscal position. In an increasingly uncertain environment, the choices before the central bank are narrowing. Too hard to handle. Record breaking temperatures last year should put environmental agencies on alert because business as usual won't work. For most of last year, global temperatures datasets had indicated that it was going to be the hottest on record. Last week, the European Union's Copernicus Climate Change Service confirmed that the average temperature in 2024 was 1.6 degrees Celsius more than that of pre-industrial era. 0.1% more than the record set in 2023. The blistering heat does not yet mean that the world has defaulted on the Paris Pact's threshold. The grim milestone is measured in decadal averages and not on the basis of yearly temperature increases. But the forest fires raging in the US are the latest in the series of destructive events over 12 months that frame the seriousness of the climate crisis. According to the United Nations Environment Program, stock taking in October last year, if countries do not change course drastically, the world will see warming of more than 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. The UNEP studies estimates that global emissions need to drop to about 42% of the 2019 levels in the next 10 years to keep temperatures rise below Paris Pact threshold. Data on global warming mitigation targets put the seriousness of this challenge in perspective. If all countries were to meet their current Paris Pact pledges by 2030, emissions would drop by only 10%. The UN report was released about a month before the UNFCCC COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan, yet the annual climate meet saw very little, by the way, of creative interventions on ways to reduce emissions. Countries are expected to announce new climate mitigation plans, nationally determined contributions or NDCs by the end of February. However, the recent history of climate negotiations offer very little hope that these pledges would be ambitious enough to maintain the sanctity of the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. At Baku, the progress on the issue was stalled after a negotiation bloc of developing countries objected to any agreement that would give the UNFCCC oversight over how the NDCs are framed or implemented. Most global Met agencies do not forecast that 2025 will be as hot as 2024, but policymakers would be wrong to read that as a respite. Several national weather bodies, including India's, reckon that reckon their countries will continue to experience high temperatures. More importantly, globally the temperature rise is likely to be only marginally lower than the past 2 years. The UK's Met Office, in fact, believes that 2025 could be third hottest year on record. Environmental agencies all over the world have to have their work cut out. Djokovic once more. Nothing cyclical about it. India has real opportunity, but growth slowdown is a signal of declining confidence in government. The downward revision of India's growth prospect to 6.4% in FY25, down from 8.2%, the lowest growth forecast since the pandemic, should be dominating the news cycle. Official response to this was predictable. India is still one of the fastest growing economies. This downturn is cyclical. Growth is often indeed cyclical, but in Indian official economic discourse, the term cyclical is not an analytical word, it is a word of evasion. If the slowdown were cyclical in a genuine economic sense, it would have been anticipated. But we had to drastically revise down our own projections. This suggests that we have a very weak underlying analytical and data framework that conditions under which we think the cycle will be up or down. Second, this downturn comes on the heels of a very short upturn. Are our very high growth episodes now really going to be that short? The world is uncertain, predictions can go awry, but most official statements, whether from the finance ministry or the RBI, suggest that we have a very little idea of what growth or inflation mix to plan for and what might drive that mix. Perhaps this itself can contribute to denting confidence in the Indian economy. But the faith in cyclical is a fatalistic evasion. We have still a monsoon economy mindset. Like the season, the economy will correct itself. Perhaps this is appropriate for an economy where good rain and modest agricultural growth in this cycle have saved us from what might have otherwise been a bigger slump. Capital formation in the private sector has been expanding at a snail's pace for close to a decade now. High net worth individuals continue to flee India. Private consumption is virtually stagnant. Wages are stagnant. There is a slump in manufacturing. Household savings are declining. The middle class is squeezed. Small retail loan defaults are rising, albeit from a small base. India's cash-rich large companies seem to struggle for investable projects. 3.5 decades after liberalization, India is still massively reliant on public spending and monsoon to shore up growth. This is an astonishing thought. But here is what should be worrying the government more. Investors may not say it openly out of fear or politeness, but privately, even amongst those industrialists who will vote BJP, there is a crisis of confidence in the government. This ironically often stems from things the government thinks uh, it is doing well, not just from things it is not doing. Here are three new issues that investors are talking about. It is no secret that growth has been driven by increases in government capital expenditure, but there are two worries about the nature of this capital expenditure. It is dominated by roads and railways. In principle, these are two important items, but there is increasingly a worry that India is doing its capital expenditure more mindlessly. Unlike the capital expenditure on Golden Quadrilateral, PMGSY, or other road projects, the efficiency and productivity gains from the type of projects we are now funding seem to be far less. Smaller investments that can produce greater efficiency gains are being neglected at the cost of capex mania. Capex is driven more by a penchant for speculative infrastructure nationalism than economic sense. Second, transition into construction labor may hold current employment levels steady, but construction labor in India is seldom a pathway to enhancing the quality of lives and human capital. So, the government's success is actually being treated as a potential liability. Given how dependent India is on government capex, there has not been, since the Planning Commission was abolished, any analytically worthy assessment of India's capex priorities and the costs it entails. Second, there is amongst investors talk of government delusion in India. While the government announces new schemes galore, its particular schemes can now be seen as are now uh, seen as failures. As is often the case in India, the government was good at distributing one-off goods, opening bank accounts, gas and electricity connections, and so forth. But these schemes simply cannot paper over systemic weaknesses. Its grandiose schemes are now littered like torn-up advertisements, which is what many of them turned out to be or were meant to be. There was no scheme for which excitement was greater than Swachh Bharat. It was an economic morale or social necessity, but after the initial successes in building toilets, even the health gains of reducing open defecation were reduced because of an inability to prevent waste discharge into groundwater. Traveling around India, it is hard to avoid the impression that it is at least filthy, if not filthier. Since the Kumbh Mela is on, it might be pertinent to ask where Namami Gange virtually disappeared, how slow our progress has been in sewage treatment plants, but failure of these schemes is part of credibility crisis of the government. This is government delusion. When not executed well, they signify misallocation of energy and capital, and they have lowered confidence that India can address long standing routine problems that make it an unattractive country. From a regulatory point of view, the government's four cardinal sins are: first, reneging reneging on minimum government, maximum governance. Admittedly, this is a complex issue, but there is an almost offensive insensitivity in the finance ministry to concerns about needles regulatory confusion and complexity, whether in taxation or GST. And in defenders of the prime minister will offer blame on the bureaucrats. This is a bad move. It makes government look weak and evasive. Second, the sheen is now off the government on corruption. There was always going to be centralized and whole scale corruption. The demands of political finance make that inevitable, but the reputation of retail corruption at the level of transactions is back with a vengeance. Third, there is diminishing confidence that India's political economy will push for real reform. The government is quite comfortable with a political economy of growth for the top 10% combined with gestures of welfare architecture for the bottom. India's capital has made its Faustian bargain with the state. Finally, this must be repeated ad nauseum. India's capital connection and championing of three or four large players is sucking out the competition and energy of India's private sector. The fear of any moderately successful enterprise that it can be uh, expropriate, expropriated to benefit existing big players is real. This is conscious choice the government has made. Once upon a story, Bollywood must let go of the fear that art comes in the way of commerce. How and not why MSP? In a democracy, governments will intervene in agri markets with price distorting mechanisms that favor consumers. This needs to be balanced with by assured price supporting mechanism for farmers. It is disappointing to see a distinguished agricultural economist damn the flagship demand of the country's farmers as no less than a folly, and that too at a time when farmers' leader is on fast and to death in support of this demand. No doubt farmers and activists can commit follies, but so economists, especially when driven by an ideology. In arguing against the demand for legal guarantee for MSP, Ashok Gulati acknowledges that farmers deserve better prices and that they don't get the MSP announced by the government, but vehemently opposes legal guarantee as the solution, for it would distort agricultural markets and would not be in line with liberalization of the economy. Over the last few years, many commentators and economists have revised their skepticism about the demand for MSP entitlement, shifting the debate from why to how. The farmers' movement has nuanced its demand to meet initial objections. It is therefore particularly disappointing that Gulati has refused to move with the times. There is national hypocrisy on this issue. Everyone loves MSP as long it is not implemented. No one argues that government should not declare fair minimum price or that it must not support farmers in realizing this price. The trouble begins when farmers start expecting worse, demanding that this promise be made real. When a concrete proposal for assured realization of this promissory note is put forward, Gulati reflects the same moral ambivalence. He does not question the idea of an MSP, though he hints MSP may have become an outdated concept and talks about ways to make it more effective. At the same time, he offers no concrete solution other than creating a price stabilization fund for pulses and oilseeds. Freer markets, free of price distorting interventions in favor of the farmers or the consumers seem to be his solution. He wants an end to the inherent consumer bias in the agri price policy that results in price suppressing policies that penalize the farmers. But the eminent professor does not seem to know what an ordinary farmer activist knows. In a poor country with electoral democracy, no government can afford to allow food prices to go up, while the government will be happy to use his expertise to avoid robust intervention to implement MSP. They would continue to interfere in markets and international trade against farmers, as they have done for 33 years post liberalization. So, this is price suppressing bias of the government will have to be counterbalanced with an assured price support mechanism for farmers, that is, legally guaranteed MSP. Thus, demand is not a plea for compassion, and Gulati thinks it is anchored in an unwritten social contract between the Indian state and farmers. Having breached its part, of the contract, now the state wants to abrogate it, leaving the farmers to face climate change and unfair global competition. Gulati conflates the demand for assured MSP with a demand for universal state procurement or for a legally punitive ban on trade below the MSP. Both these strawmen are easy to demolish. The farmer is impossible, the latter is counterproductive. He does not bother to notice that these two early formulations of the demand have given way to more sophisticated mechanisms for the assured realization of MSP. In our article last week, we had proposed bucket of four interrelated policies to ensure that every farmer can realize at least the MSP. First, the government should widen the food basket in public distribution system and expand its current levels of procurement at MSP. Second, there should be well funded and carefully targeted market intervention scheme to prevent prices falling below the MSP. Third, the import-export policy should be tweaked to ensure that it is not price suppressing for domestic markets. Finally, if all these measures fail to yield MSP, as would the case in many crops, given the need of poor consumers, the government should be not legally mandated to compensate farmers by the way of price deficit payment for the difference. Gulati does not engage with this proposal or a better formulation that he knows in its entirety. His only response is to the price deficiency payment, which he rejects as a legally mandated MSP would impede price discovery and promote collusion. Here again, he uses the convenient weaker opponent in failed Bhavantar experiment in Madhya Pradesh. Unfortunately, Harish Damodran's otherwise persuasive advocacy of MSP also relies on MP model where the farmer gets compensated based on the receipt from the trader. This can lead to collusion between farmers and traders. We had suggested a different modality, drawing upon Haryana's Bhavantar scheme for Bajra that does not ask farmers for a receipt of sale. Farmers can be compensated on a pro rata basis depending upon official data on area sown, average productivity in the locality, and average price deficit. Gulati chose not to engage with this more robust counterproposal. Strangely, Gulati chose the example of rapid recent growth in fisheries, meat, poultry, milk, and horticulture to prove that market based systems have performed much better than the government controlled MSP regime. This fast growth is a result of changing consumer preference or opening up of export markets that has nothing to do with having or not having MSP. Between 2011-12, the cumulative growth of MSP, crop mustard, and green gram outdoes horticultural crop. Besides, the example of milk illustrates that such a growth not trickle down the growth in income for farmers in all kinds of markets that it needs state intervention. Gulati also alludes to state cost estimates being floated by some activists, but it dismisses it a priori. We have received the estimate we offered last week to include all 20 crops covered by MSP except sugarcane, jute, and copra, for which independent mechanisms exist, and to correct for one computational error for mustard based on state-wise crop-wise calculation of price deficit for 2022-23. As per this calculation, the upper limit of government expenditure for government MSP uh, price deficit payment that year would have been 26,000 crore, 0.6% of budget and 0.1% of GDP going by present MSP, or 1,68,000, 4.26% of the budget and 0.62% of GDP if we go by revised MSP, C2 plus 50% demanded by the farmers. If the public sector banks could offer a write-off of 2.8 lakh crore of debts and governments could waive 1 lakh crore of corporate taxes in the same year, why this unease about supporting farmers who feed the country? Since Gulati seemed to agree that MSP should be made more effective, would he likely to suggest an assured mechanism for that? Or is his opposition due to unease of die-hard free market ideologue? Claims about rising inequality overestimate income share of the richest don't account for drastic reduction in poverty. As if words were arrows, there is a new genre called herd sentiment literature.